There are sounds that stop a city, a gunshot, a siren, the screech of tires before a collision. But on a humid afternoon in June of 1962, the sound that froze Harlem wasn't mechanical. It was the sound of a palm striking flesh. It was a sharp, dry crack that echoed off the brick facades of Lenox Avenue, louder than the traffic, louder than the hustle. We are on 125th Street, the heart of the kingdom. The air smells of exhaust fumes, roasted peanuts, and the heavy, humid promise of a summer storm. The sidewalk is crowded. Men in short-sleeved shirts are wiping sweat from their necks. Women are fanning themselves with church bulletins. And in the middle of the crowd stands Mae Johnson. She is the Queen of Harlem, the wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. She walks with her head high, a woman who has navigated the shark-infested waters of the underworld without ever getting wet. She is untouchable, or so she thought. Blocking her path is a man who doesn't belong here. Vincent Vinnie, Terranova, a soldier from the Genovese family. He is 34 years old, wearing a suit that is too heavy for the weather and too cheap for his ambition. He reeks of Old Spice and desperation. He has come to Harlem to make a name for himself, to prove to his captains downtown that he can muscle the sport in life. He steps in front of Mae. He doesn't see a queen. He sees a leverage point. He sees a message he can send to a husband he is too afraid to face, man to man. The narrator tells us that Vinnie grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into the fabric of her dress. He shouted something about protection money, something about the neighborhood belonging to the Italians now, words meant to intimidate. Mae didn't scream. She didn't cower. She simply pulled her arm away and told him to remove his hands. It was a command, not a request. And that is when Vinnie Terranova made the mistake that would destroy his life. He swung. It wasn't a punch, it was a slap, an open-handed strike, across the face of the most protected woman in New York City. The impact was sickening. Mae's head snapped to the side. Her grocery bag slipped from her fingers, hitting the concrete. Oranges rolled into the gutter. A quart of milk burst, spilling a white pool across the hot gray sidewalk. Then came the silence. It was a vacuum, a radius of 30 feet where time simply stopped. The hustlers stopped hustling. The kids stopped playing. Every pair of eyes on that block fixed on Vinnie Terranova. They weren't looking at him with anger. They were looking at him with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for a man standing on the ledge of a building. Vinnie stood there, his chest heaving, waiting for the fear. He expected her to cry. He expected her to run. But Mae Johnson just straightened her hat. She looked at him. She didn't look afraid. She looked at him with profound, terrifying pity. She knew, in that split second, that the man standing before her was already dead. He was a walking corpse who just hadn't been informed of his own funeral date yet. He had touched the third rail. He had slapped the face of the king. That sound, the slap heard round the underworld, didn't start a war. It ended one before it even began. Like this video if you believe that true power isn't about what you do to your enemy, but what you don't do. To understand why that slap echoed like a gunshot, you have to understand the man whose name was on the marriage certificate. You have to understand the ecosystem of Harlem in 1962. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a city within a city, a place where the police were just tourists with badges and the real law was written in the back rooms of jazz clubs and the basements of brownstones. It was a world of the sport in life, where illegal numbers running wasn't just a crime, it was the bank, the credit union, and the social safety net for a people locked out of the American dream. And sitting at the head of the table was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. They called him the Professor as much as they called him Bumpy. By 1962, he had evolved. He wasn't just the muscle anymore, he was the institution. He had spent years in Alcatraz studying law, philosophy, and history. He could quote the Constitution better than the judges who sentenced him, and he played chess with a cold mathematical precision that terrified his enemies more than any gun. He was the CEO of the streets. He didn't just administer violence, he administered order. When Bumpy walked into the Flash Inn, the atmosphere didn't just shift, it pressurized. You could feel the gravity of the man. He didn't demand respect, he inhaled it. He was a paradox. This was a man who was known to beat a rival half to death with a pool cue for disrespecting a lady, yet spent his weekends delivering coal to freezing families in the tenements and paying college tuition for the children of his runners. He was the monster who kept the other monsters away. He was the reason a woman could walk down 125th Street at midnight with a pocket full of cash and not look over her shoulder, because everyone knew that mugging a civilian meant answering to Bumpy. But the Italians, they never understood this duality. The Genovese family looked uptown and saw only chaos. They saw the jungle. They didn't see the structure. They didn't see the loyalty. Vinnie Terranova saw Mae Johnson and thought she was just a woman. He didn't realize that in Harlem, she was the crown jewels. He didn't realize that by touching her, he hadn't just committed assault. He had committed blasphemy. And Bumpy Johnson, the chess player, was about to make a move that no one in the Italian mob saw coming. He wasn't going to send soldiers. He wasn't going to send bullets. He was going to send a mirror. Bad news in Harlem travels faster than electricity. It moves through the barbershops, bounces off the stoops, and whispers through the kitchen windows. By the time the orange juice from Mae's grocery bag had dried on the sidewalk, the word was already ascending the stairs of Small's paradise. The man who carried the weight of that news was Illinois Gordon. Illinois wasn't just a lieutenant. He was the vault where Bumpy stored his trust. They had survived the lean years together, back when a switchblade was their only equity. Illinois was the only man who could walk into Bumpy's office without knocking. But today, he didn't just walk in. He entered with the gravity of a man carrying a live grenade. Bumpy didn't look up from his ledger. He sensed the shift in the air pressure. He knew Illinois' breathing pattern like he knew his own. He paused, his fountain pen hovering over a column of numbers. The narrator tells us that Illinois didn't use euphemisms. He didn't sugarcoat it. He stood there, hat in hand, and delivered the sentence that would change the trajectory of the summer. 125th and Lenox, Illinois said, his voice low. Vinnie Terranova. He put his hands on Mae. For 10 seconds, the world stopped turning. Bumpy didn't table flip. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for the gun in the drawer. He went absolutely, terrifyingly still. It was the stillness of a reptilian predator deciding whether to strike or to swallow whole. He asked 3 questions. Is she hurt? Is she safe? Where is he now? Illinois confirmed that Mae was physically unharmed but shaken. She was home. And Vinnie? Vinnie was still strutting down Lenox Avenue, proud of his victory, oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own death warrant. Bumpy stood up. He walked to the window. He looked down at the street, the kingdom he had built, the people he protected. A Genovese soldier had just violated the sanctity of the crown. If Bumpy reacted with rage, he looked weak. If he did nothing, he looked dead. He needed a response that was louder than violence. To understand the stupidity of the act, you have to understand the poison that fueled it. That poison was ambition. Vincent, the slick Terranova, was a man born in the shadow of giants. He grew up hearing stories of Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese, men who moved mountains with a whisper. Vinnie wanted that. He hungered for it like a starving dog. But he lacked the intellect. He lacked the grace. He was a made man, in name only. To the captains downtown, he was a blunt instrument, useful for breaking kneecaps, but useless for strategy. The Genovese family had been trying to crack Harlem for years. They looked at the numbers racket and saw millions of dollars flowing through black hands, and it offended their sense of order. They wanted a piece, so they sent Vinnie. They told him to shake the tree. They told him to make their presence felt. But Vinnie, in his arrogance, mistook instructions for permission. He looked at Bumpy Johnson and didn't see a strategist. He saw an obstacle. He thought that by humiliating Bumpy's wife, he would break Bumpy's spirit. He thought he was proving his dominance, but Vinnie had forgotten the first rule of the jungle. Never wound what you cannot kill. He sat in that club in the village, drinking espresso, bragging to the other soldiers about how he had slapped the queen. He felt powerful. He felt untouchable. He didn't know that 5 miles uptown, a phone call was being made. He didn't know that Bumpy Johnson wasn't gathering soldiers. He was gathering information. Bumpy wasn't looking for Vinnie's location to kill him. He was looking for Vinnie's heart. He was looking for the things Vinnie loved. And unlike Vinnie, Bumpy Johnson didn't miss. Violence is loud. Violence brings the police. Bumpy Johnson didn't want the police. He wanted a ghost. That night, Bumpy didn't call his enforcers. He didn't open the crate of Thompson submachine guns hidden in the basement. Instead, he made a single phone call to a man in the Bronx. A man who didn't carry a gun, but carried a Leica M3 with a telephoto lens, the narrator. Tells us that for the next 72 hours, Vincent Terranova was the most watched man in New York City. But he didn't know it. He was too busy celebrating. The photographer was a professional. He became a shadow. He sat in a parked sedan across from Vinnie's brownstone in Carroll Gardens. He followed Vinnie's mother to Mass on Sunday morning. He stood across the street from the elementary school, documenting the exact time the crossing guard blew her whistle. Click. The wife. Click. The mother. Click. The children. Every aspect of Vinnie's life was captured on high-contrast Kodak film. The privacy of his existence was stripped away, layer by layer. On the third night, the package was ready. Bumpy sat alone in his office. He wasn't assembling a hit list. He was assembling a family album. He placed the photo of the children next to the photo of the mother. It was a perverse mirror of domestic bliss. Most men would have sent a bullet in an envelope. It's cheap. It's direct. But Bumpy Johnson understood psychology. He knew that the fear of death is fleeting, but the fear of loss, that is eternal. He closed the heavy leather cover of the album. He ran his hand over the grain. It cost $200. It looked like something you would give as a wedding gift. But inside, it was a weapon of mass destruction. Betrayal never comes from your enemies. It always comes from the hand you shake. But true terror? True terror comes when you realize the enemy knows the names of your children. What time is it where you are watching this? Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like you were being watched. Tuesday, June 12th, 7:30 a.m. The sun was shining on President Street. Inside the Terranova household, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Vinnie was in his bathrobe. His guard was down. Why wouldn't it be? He was miles away from Harlem. He was in the fortress of the Italian neighborhood, surrounded by friends, cousins, and fellow soldiers. He believed geography protected him. He believed that 125th Street was a foreign country. Then came the knock. It wasn't a pounding. It wasn't the police. It was the polite, rhythmic knock of a delivery man. Vinnie walked to the door. He opened it to find a courier standing on the stoop, a young kid with a cap pulled low, holding a rectangular package wrapped in brown butcher paper. No return address, just Vinnie's name written in elegant cursive script. "Sign here," the kid said. Vinnie signed. He took the box. It felt light, harmless. He took it into his study. He sat down at his desk, the same desk where he counted his loan sharking money. He tore open the paper. When he saw the leather album, he was confused. Was it an anniversary gift? A present from the boss? He opened the cover. The first photo was his mother leaving church. The second was his wife loading groceries. The third was his daughter standing at the bus stop. The air left the room. Vinnie's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He flipped the pages faster. Click, click, click. His entire world, his sanctuary, every person he loved framed in the crosshairs of a camera lens, and on the final page, there was no photo, just a note, handwritten. The narrator reads the note in Bumpy's voice, calm, professorial, terrifying. You put your hands on my wife in public. I could have put my hands on everyone you love in private, but I didn't, because I am not you. Vinnie dropped the album. It hit the desk with a heavy thud. He looked out the window at the street he thought was safe, and for the first time in his life, he realized that there were no walls high enough to keep Bumpy Johnson out. The distance between life and death isn't always measured in bullets. Sometimes it's measured in information. An hour later, Vincent Terranova stood in the back room of the village social club. He was vibrating with a frequency of pure terror. Across from him sat Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, a capo who had survived 3 gang wars by being smarter than the man holding the gun. Vinnie didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply slid the leather album across the mahogany table. Tony Ducks opened the book. He saw the mother. He saw the wife. He saw the children. The room went silent. The kind of silence that usually happens right before an execution. Tony wasn't looking at pictures. He was looking at a diagram of a security breach so total, so absolute, that it made his blood run cold. He realized what Vinnie hadn't. This wasn't just a threat against a soldier. This was Bumpy Johnson telling the entire Genovese crime family that their walls were made of paper. Tony closed the album. He looked at Vinnie. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. The narrator tells us that Tony spoke with the quiet, terrifying clarity of a judge passing sentence. He told Vinnie that he was a fool. He told him that Bumpy Johnson had just spared his life, not out of mercy, but to make a point. He could have killed them all, Tony said. He could have killed your mother while she was praying. He could have taken your girls while they were waiting for the bus, and he didn't. He chose not to. Vinnie tried to argue. He tried to say it was just a trick, but Tony cut him off. The realization hit Vinnie then. The click of the trap snapping shut. Bumpy hadn't just defeated him, he had emasculated him. He had shown Vinnie that his life existed only because Bumpy Johnson allowed it to continue. The predator had become the pet. The sentence was handed down at noon. It wasn't prison. It wasn't death. It was erasure. Tony Ducks gave Vinnie a choice: leave New York today or stay and face the consequences of a war the family refused to fight. Vinnie Terranova, the man who wanted to be the king of Harlem, spent his afternoon packing a station wagon. He pulled his children out of school. He told his weeping wife to pack only what she could carry. He didn't say goodbye to his mother. He couldn't face her, knowing that his arrogance had put a target on her back. By 5 p.m., the Terranova family was crossing the Verrazzano Bridge, heading south. They didn't stop until they hit New Jersey. They kept driving until the skyline of New York was just a memory in the rearview mirror. Vinnie Terranova never set foot in Harlem again. He never walked down 125th Street. He spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows, haunted by a leather-bound book and the ghost of the man who let him live. Back at the Flash Inn, the phone didn't ring. There was no retaliation from the Italians, no car bombs, no hitmen. The silence was the answer. Bumpy stood by the window, swirling his cognac. He had won without firing a shot. He had protected his wife, his neighborhood, and his crown simply by holding up a mirror to the enemy and letting them see their own vulnerability. If a gun was in your face and it jammed, or if a man held your family's life in his hands and let them go, which would haunt you more? The bullet you dodged or the mercy you didn't deserve? Type bullet or mercy in the comments. The ripples of that photo album traveled far beyond Vinnie Terranova's kitchen table. They reached the highest levels of the commission. A week later, a meeting was held, not to plan a war against Harlem, but to rewrite the rules of engagement. The album had been passed around. The bosses saw what Tony Duck saw. Bumpy Johnson wasn't playing by street rules, he was playing by statecraft. They realized that escalating a feud with Bumpy over a slap that violated their own codes of conduct regarding women, was a losing proposition. It would make them look weak. It would expose their families. A quiet directive was issued. It wasn't written down, but it was etched into stone. No operations in Harlem without explicit approval, no touching civilians, and absolutely no touching the Queen. The Genovese family retreated, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. Bumpy had forced them to check their own kings. He had drawn a line in the asphalt of 110th Street that even the mafia was afraid to cross. The story of the slap and the photo album became a legend in the underworld. It was whispered in prison yards and shouted in jazz clubs. It became a parable about the nature of power. Vincent Terranova faded into obscurity, a man who had everything and lost it all because he mistook silence for weakness. But Mae Johnson, she continued to walk with her head high. She knew that she walked in the shadow of a man who could burn the world down for her, but loved her enough to simply put out the fire instead. In the end, Bumpy Johnson taught the world a lesson that no gun could ever teach. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the one screaming threats. It's the one who quietly hands you a picture of your life and lets you decide if you want to keep it. Bumpy Johnson protected his wife without spilling a drop of blood. He proved that sometimes a camera is deadlier than a cannon. Where are you watching from? And do you think Bumpy showed mercy, or was exile the cruelest punishment of all? Let me know in the comments, and if you want more stories from the Harlem underworld that history tried to forget, subscribe now. This is Untold Mafia Stories.